What were some things that you found were stigmatizing that you wanted to change? How far have we come in your mind's eye?
Well, there's a big long list, isn't there? I think, one of the first things is just sort of the type of person that is supposed to get an eating disorder. And I do think that that's changing. It's no longer this perception quite as much that it's a 14-year-old white girl that hates her body that gets an eating disorder. And I think that as the field has begun to understand energy deficit, and that any person can go into energy deficit and then could potentially develop an eating disorder, they're able to see that. The biggest, so those things are kind of changing. That adults can get eating disorders and that a person can develop an eating disorder way into their adult years. That men can get eating disorders, and that people who do not want to be thin more than anything else in the world before they have an eating disorder can get eating disorders as well. And then there's also different racial aspects. People of color are often overlooked. I think, though, the biggest underlying problem, and it's still as bad, is that in some respects, I think that a person with an eating disorder doesn't necessarily need it to be treated differently from a person without an eating disorder with regards to many things if they go into a doctor's office. But that's because I don't believe that any person, regardless of whether they have an eating disorder or not, or their body size, should be going into a doctor's office and be told to restrict food. And so the reason that happens is because our culture has an unconscious bias that weight loss is always good and weight gain is always bad. Mm-hmm. And the problem with that is that it's an unconscious bias, which means most people are not conscious that they have it. But we all have it in our culture. And so that means that doctors, nutritionists, healthcare providers are all brought up into this unconscious bias of weight loss is good and weight gain is bad, and that fat is bad and that thin is good. And so you do have people walking into doctors' offices and being told, without being examined and without being actually determined whether they're healthy or not, being told that they need to lose weight. And so that's until we can change that unconscious bias, there's always going to be this problem, because it's bad enough when a person with an eating disorder that eating disorder behavior is reinforced by anybody, including a doctor. Many doctors used to applaud me at how much I exercised. That was the last thing I needed.
Me too.
Many doctors used to say, well, gosh, aren't you skinny? That and sound as if I was healthy. And that's, of course, not the way that you should talk to a person with an eating disorder, but it's also not the way that you should talk to a person without an eating disorder. If a person is in a normal BMI and they're excessively exercising and restricting food, they should be told not to. If a person is in a higher than normal BMI and they are excessively exercising, restricting food, purging, or any of those, they should be told not to. And so I think there's this issue that our doctors, our healthcare providers, and our culture still looks at a person's weight and makes a decision about their state of health based on that their weight, and not actually based on any metrics of their state of health. And so until that changes, it's going to continue to be difficult for people with eating disorders. It's going to be even more difficult for people with eating disorders who are in anything other than a stick-thin body. And it's going to be difficult for people with, all sorts of versions of disordered eating, when we're still being judged, that we're still in this unconscious bias that thin is always good and fat is always bad.
I relate to that because I've been doing a lot of support work for BEAT in the UK, and a lot of people are actually saying online, they're saying that they're getting turned away from their GPs because their GP says that they don't meet the BMI criteria. Mm-hmm. They're feeling as if they have to go away and lose more weight, and it's just sending them right back into the eating disorder, or even worse.
Right. And so I think that until it can be understood that the severity of an eating disorder should be determined by mental state markers rather than a person's weight, I think that it's going to be struggling. If a person is displaying all of the same mental state markers as somebody that has a very low weight, they're restricting food just as much, they're compulsively exercising, they're purging, they have obsessive thoughts around food, they have mental hunger, all of those things. If all of those things are going on, that person has a severe eating disorder, regardless of what weight they are. And until the field can catch up and actually begin to look at mental state markers and behaviors rather than body weight, it's just, you know, we can try and make some changes and we can try and make some improvements, but people are still going to continue to get sicker rather than get better. And they have to get sicker to get admitted to treatment.
Yeah.
My GP actually said to me recently, when I regularly go for like checking in my weight and things like that, also as well as my eating disorder nurse, but my eating disorder nurse has never gave me any therapy. The only thing that's ever really helped me is following your work and your book and things like that. I actually gave them a copy of your book. They're now using it in their eating disorder ward and things like that, because they said that they've never seen anything like this and they're trying to kind of implement things. But my doctor actually said to me the last time I was there to see him, he says, "You've no longer got an eating disorder." And I thought, that's just a bit
right.
He just doesn't class me as having an eating disorder, even though because I don't have eating disorder thoughts, but it's still there.
Yeah.
I'm not going to kid myself on in that. But it just shows you the way they think, exactly what you were saying.
Right. And you know how difficult it is when you do have an eating disorder to advocate for yourself, to advocate against your own eating disorder. I should eat more food. So it's even more difficult when the healthcare providers are saying, "No, you're good, you're fine, you don't have an eating disorder anymore," and you kind of know that you do. And so it's just how anybody can actually recover in that sort of environment sometimes boggles my mind. But people can and they do, because generally people with restrictive eating disorders are very smart, determined people that can do whatever they want when they put their mind to it. And if that was not the case, the death rate would be a heck of a lot higher than it is right now.
Yeah, even as well, I was in at my eating disorder nurse 2 weeks ago, and this is the thing that got me. If I had been in a bad place, this would have probably triggered me massively. But this was a Friday, and the dietitian that was actually standing next to us turned around to me and she says, "Where are you going to after this, Tommy? Are you doing anything today?" And I says, "No, I'm just going home after this." And she says, "You'll be glad to know this is our happy day of the week. This is the day where we eat fish and chips or whatever we want. We call it Fat Friday."
You need to invite me to this. I will come over there.
Wow. I mean, I just couldn't believe it, but that's just the way they seem to go on. It's crazy.
And that's a really great example of that sort of unconscious bias. It's just so ingrained that people don't even know that they are operating under that bias, and they're operating within that bias and talking in a way that reinforces that bias. Mm-hmm. And the problem with unconscious biases is that a lot of the time it's because it's a cultural thing. It's being taught to us when we're really young, before we can even know how to talk. And so if you can imagine that you're a baby and you're sitting in and you know, your mum's having a baby gathering. I can't remember what they call those when they get, mums and toddlers groups. Yeah. And, like as a baby, you're sitting there in this cot and the adults are talking, and you will undoubtedly at some point or many points be hearing those adults talking about weight loss as if it's a good thing and about weight gain as if it's a bad thing. And you're a baby, so you don't know what the words mean. But babies are paying attention to everything. That's kind of their only job. They just sit there and pay attention to everything. And so your brain at that point is picking up that these words, weight loss, obviously is good. It's getting good. And the words weight gain, that's bad. The humans are not reacting well to that. And so that's how unconscious bias works, that it's so cultural that it's everywhere, that even by the time you're 3, it's well ingrained. You know that weight loss is good, and you know that weight gain is bad, and you know that thin is good, and you know that fat is bad. And so then, by the time you're 10, it's just deep rooted into this part of your brain that holds the belief systems about how the world works and what's true in the world. And that's why it's so damn difficult. Because our brains hold on to these things. Belief systems are very difficult in the brain to change for good reason. The brain's designed to be difficult about changing belief systems.
A lot of that recently, but
yeah. And so we're sort of fighting against this really big beast, not even in just our own, many of us actually are able to identify this and we can start to change our own belief systems. But then we're sitting in a culture that's constantly reinforcing the belief system that we're trying to change. And if you're determined and if you're consistent and if you're stubborn, you can still change that belief system in your own head. Changing that belief system in the culture, mind you, that's a completely different beast.